Hello, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. Welcome to session 3 of our day-long event titled Making Democracy Real, Encouraging an Active Citizenry. This next session goes under the heading Partisan Nation, the Dangerous New Logic of American Politics in a Nationalized Era. It is based upon a recently published book of the same name, produced by University of Chicago Press. We are honored to have with us today political scientists Paul Pierson and Eric Schickler. They'll be exploring how America's democratic crisis is rooted in a dangerous mismatch between our Constitution and today's nationalized partisan politics. Paul Pierson is the John Gross Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley and director of the Berkeley Economic and Society Initiative. He is the author of, or co-author of 6 books, including Winner Take All Politics, Let Them Eat Tweets, and Politics in Time. He'll be joined by Eric Schickler, who is a Jeffrey and Ashley McDermott Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, including Racial Realignment, Investigating the President, and Filibuster. We will be posting links with which you may purchase copies of Partisan Nation. Also going to be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the talk, so please do post questions and comments in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. Also want to make an acknowledgement, as we always do at the beginning of these events. We are indeed broadcasting from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. Wanted to take a moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Paul Pierson, Eric Schickler, welcome to City Lights. It is a pleasure having you with us today. So glad you could be part of this program.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to City Lights and to those of you who are taking time out of your Saturday to talk about the state of American democracy. And our plan was we're going to talk for maybe half an hour about the book, and then hopefully have plenty of time for any questions that people might have. And you know, I'm going to start and maybe begin by just saying there's maybe some good news and some bad news. The good news, maybe for those of you who are feeling anxious as the election approaches, that we're going to try to zoom out from the election. But the bad news is I think the picture still looks pretty alarming when you zoom out. The way we've been thinking about how to frame what we're up to in this book, it's like if you were studying the hurricanes that recently hit the United States, and you might think about a bunch of things that you wanted to talk about the nature of those hurricanes and the devastation that they've caused. But then if you take a step back and think about things like a climate scientist, you would say, well, what we really want to know is why there are more hurricanes than there used to be, and why those hurricanes seem more intense on average than they used to be. And that's basically the approach that we take in this book. We're trying to understand not just what's happening in 2024, but why the increasing acrimony in American politics, often described as partisan polarization, the fierce conflict between 2 opposing teams, why that has been become so intense and so durable in the United States. And we think addressing that question can give us a lot of insight into the political moment that we find ourselves in. So just as a reminder of how long this has been going on, I remember when the Gingrich Revolution happened, that it was kind of, I think, startling to people in the United States to see the intensity of the conflict around the Gingrich Revolution, the contract with America, when Republicans swept the 1994 elections and took control of Congress for the first time in decades. And the reason why I start there is just to note that that was 30 years ago, right? When we started saying, boy, you know, things have gotten really intense. The conflict between the parties has gotten really intense. That was 30 years ago, and it's only intensified since then. There's really been no break. I mean, maybe you could say for 6 months after 9/11, there was a brief kind of rally around the flag moment. But basically, conflict between the parties, political conflict organized around the parties and being increasingly intense between the parties, has only grown in the United States over the last 30 years. And really, I think political scientists would say polarization has been growing in the United States since the mid to late 1970s. So really almost 50 years now. And that's what we're trying to understand in the book. Like, what has happened? What has it done to our politics? What might we be able to do about it? And we start with a puzzle resting in the Constitution because, and we spent a lot of time in the book talking about the Constitution. The Constitution was long thought to limit the prospects for intense and durable polarization. We describe this system in the book as Madisonian. Probably need a little asterisk when you describe it as Madisonian because truthfully, if you look at the historical record, Madison wanted a pretty different constitution. That's what he proposed to the Constitutional Convention. He lost a lot of the battles at the Constitutional Convention. But then the reason I think to call the Constitution Madisonian is because Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, and particularly Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, probably the most articulate defense, a very thoughtful defense of how this Constitution worked and why he thought it would limit what he called the dangers of faction, and particularly the idea of getting some kind of durable majoritarian faction that would stomp down on dissent and alternative views. And the argument that he develops there is that, first of all, kind of thing that you would study in an introduction to American politics class, maybe even in high school. We have a system of checks and balances, of separation of powers. As Madison put it, ambition must be made to counter ambition. And the American system does that by creating an executive, legislature, and a judiciary, all with their own significant powers. And then in addition to that, as Madison points out, you also have what he called the extended republic, right? You have a vast nation, highly diverse. And Madison actually kind of flipped the conventional wisdom of his time on its head. The conventional wisdom at the time was you couldn't really have a democracy in a large country. You could only have it in a small city-state. If you had a country of large scope, it would be hard to govern it democratically. But what Madison points out is that actually as the country is extended, you're going to have more diversity, right? There's not going to be any single dominant interest. And so if you can actually make sure that your institutions reflect that diversity, it's going to be hard for anyone to dominate the political system. And so that's what the US did through a system of federalism, right, with important state and local government, and also with even national representation resting on local politics, congressional districts, Senate seats. All of these are based on a more local geography and a highly diverse geography. So you end up, Tip O'Neill's famous line that all politics is local, right? You end up with a politics that involves shifting coalitions, weak political parties, right? Because they have to be very loose coalitions to take in all that diversity across the country. The early 20th century humorist Will Rogers famously said, "I'm a member of no organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And he meant by that yes, he was a member of the Democratic Party, but it was not an organized political party. It was quite a loose one, right? So what we show in the book, though, is that this relatively decentralized system, fluid system, in which you didn't get durable, intense polarization, was not just something that came out of those constitutional arrangements that I've just described. It rested instead on those constitutional arrangements combined with having a relatively decentralized set of what we call mediating institutions, media, interest groups, and political parties. The political parties themselves, through most of American political history, they're highly decentralized. And so what the Republicans looked like in Mississippi was completely different than what Republicans look like in Massachusetts. And what Democrats looked like in Georgia was completely different from what they looked like in California. And again, the result of this was the system tended to be fluid. It didn't line up into rigid partisan teams over extended periods of time. Now, really important to note, that doesn't mean that you couldn't get polarization. And in fact, you do get polarized, intense conflict between different political parties in various points in American political history. For those of you who have seen Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, it's really a study of political polarization in the 1790s. There's a bunch of other things too. But you can see these political parties form relatively quickly following the adoption of the Constitution with Jefferson and Madison on one side and Hamilton and Washington and Adams on the other side. And that system becomes quite intense, with each side seeing the other side as a threat to the fledgling republic in relatively short order. And of course, there's the case of the Civil War. There's the late 19th century, where again, there was very, very fierce conflict between the two political parties. But in none of these cases did that intense polarization around the parties last for very long. Right? It lasted for maybe 10, 20 years in the case of the Civil War. But then the parties tend to slip back into these more fragmented, fluid arrangements. And that's because, as we show in the book, in the historical chapters in the book, there are always these decentralized kind of centrifugal forces at play that make it hard to maintain intense one team against the other team polarization over an extended period of time. Unfortunately, we don't live in the same kind of political system that existed. And in the book, we have two chapters in which we talk about how over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, the American political system nationalized. Media became much more national. Local media becomes much less important in American politics. The political parties themselves nationalized, so that now the Republican Party in Mississippi does look more like the Republican Party in Massachusetts, even though the underlying circumstances in the state might not be very different. I mean, for those of us in California, it is striking to see how much the Republican Party in California has come to sort of mimic what the national political party looks like, even though that's essentially suicidal for elections inside California. Historically, you wouldn't expect a state party to behave that way, but now it's been pulled into this national system of polarization. And so have interest groups. Powerful interest groups have nationalized in recent American politics, and increasingly they've aligned with one political party or the other. So on all these levels, media, interest groups, the parties themselves, you see two intense teams confronting each other in national politics. And this has transformed our politics in ways that have created intense and durable and highly problematic polarization. I'll just end my part of our presentation by talking about one single contrast, which I think really brings out how much the political world has changed, even though the Constitution itself hasn't changed really at all over the period that I'm going to be talking about. So in August, we had the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon resigning the presidency, an incredible political event. And I think particularly striking when you think that only less than 2 years before Nixon resigned, he had been reelected in a landslide, an electoral landslide in 1972. And yet, by August of 1974, he was forced to resign. And I think key to understanding that, and we talk about this in the book, is that even though Nixon had won in a landslide, the Republican politicians who were aligned with him were only loosely a team. Most of them, initially, almost all of them, supported Nixon, but as evidence of his malfeasance grew, many of them deserted him. Many of them were eager to protect Congress, and they saw Nixon's attempt to expand executive power as a threat to the institution that was their political home. Many of them hailed from states whether it was in the Midwest or the Northeast, or I'm from the Northwest, which had a long history of moderate Republican politicians. So many of them came from states with moderate electorates who were not deeply committed to Richard Nixon. Organized interests did not particularly feel an allegiance to Nixon either. They didn't feel like if Nixon goes down, our interests are going to go down. So they faced much more limited pressure to stick with their teams. And of course, the media environment in 1974 was radically different from the media environment of today. Most people were not getting highly partisan news. Almost there were really no highly partisan news sources, which means that they were in information environments that were open to producing negative news about politicians from the party they favored. And that's obviously very different from the way that things are organized today, where many people are living in media bubbles that simply don't provide that kind of negative news. And so in 1974, you could get this kind of cycle in which Nixon could gradually lose support, right? Some politicians, including politicians in his own party, did not stick with him and were open to hearing critical information and doing serious investigations. That information was then produced on the news that Republicans, independents, and Democrats all received. And as that happened, Nixon's support started to decline, not just among Democrats or even independents, but among Republicans as well. And as that began to happen, more Republican politicians began to desert Nixon. And as more of them deserted Nixon, more voters could see that perhaps they should be really alarmed about his behavior. And by the end, you found yourself just a few days before Nixon resigned with staunch conservative Barry Goldwater going to the White House and telling Nixon that there were maybe 8 or 10 Republican votes supporting him in the US Senate, that he wasn't just going to be impeached by the House, he was going to be removed from office by a huge bipartisan majority in the Senate. And given that reality, Richard Nixon resigned. That's a completely different world from the world that we live in now, the world that we lived through Donald Trump's 2 impeachments, including the one that followed from January 6th. So a few weeks ago, in thinking about Nixon and Watergate, Tom Nichols at The Atlantic wrote that even Nixon had shown superior character. He was basically saying we've never had a president like Donald Trump, who simply denied all attempts to remove him from office. And Nichols, said even Nixon had a superior character to that. But what I think Eric and I would suggest is that what really was different between 1974 and 2024 was not the superior character of the president, but a superior political context, right? One in which it was possible for voters to see the reality of a president who was behaving like an authoritarian and enable the political system to take the necessary steps to do that. And the contrast between that period in American politics and the reaction of Republican elites to January 6th, I think could not be starker. And the reason why it's so different, the behavior is so different, is because they operate in a very different, much more nationalized constitutional order. So Eric now is going to tell you more about what that order looks like and maybe a little bit about what we might be able to do about the problems that are emerging from it.
All right, thanks, Paul, and thanks to City Lights for having us with you today. So, as Paul laid out, our basic argument is that the American Constitution is a poor match for the new political configuration that has taken hold, and we see major implications of that both for how policy is made and policy outcomes, and for the durability of democratic institutions in the United States. I'm going to talk first about policy, and here I think it's worth noting that for a long time, political scientists thought that we'd actually get better policy making if we had stronger, more responsible parties. But the system of checks and balances, plus the filibuster that we have, make it unlikely that one party will have the ability or the votes to govern on its own. And instead, once we have strong parties, a cohesive out party has both the motive and the opportunity to stymie the program of its opponents. Mitch McConnell's famous remark in 2009 that if Republicans just stick together and oppose all of Obama's proposals, that will make him a one-term president. It's kind of indicative of the power of the minority. Now, it may not have succeeded in defeating Obama, but it did pave the way for a lot of gridlock and for Republicans' 2010 wave where they did win the House. Now, the basic claim we make is that polarized parties, checks and balances, and the filibuster are a recipe for legislative gridlock, but crucially, a gridlocked Congress is not the same as a gridlocked political system. Instead, what happens is policy-making power has shifted from Congress to the president and to the Supreme Court, a development that disrupts the Constitution's balance of powers, raises the stakes for each presidential election, and also offers major advantages to those on the right. So, unpacking that a little bit. In recent decades, presidents have become more and more aggressive in drawing on their unilateral power to move policy. Executive orders on issues such as immigration, abortion, and the environment have a major impact on policy. Now, in the past, these actions might run the risk of reversal by Congress, but as long as the president's co-partisans stick with them, as they're strongly inclined to do in this polarized context, there's really no chance of legislative action to overcome a presidential veto when Congress does try to react. So presidents can be more aggressive in use of this unilateral power. They're also more aggressive in their use of the bureaucracy, their ability to control appointments. Executive officials have a lot of discretion over how policies are implemented, how laws are enforced, and Congress is a weaker check once it's gridlocked. And you can see one of former President Trump's last moves in office as a kind of harbinger of this, of some of the biggest dangers with this agenda, as he moved to shift thousands of career civil servants into political appointees he could fire at will and replace with loyalists. Now, President Biden reversed that order, which is known as Schedule F, but Trump has promised to reinstate it if he takes office, and really poses a clear danger about the president using control of the bureaucracy to implement policies that lack public support with very little accountability. And one example to think about here is on access to medicated abortions and the abortion pill. In addition to the presidency, the courts have capitalized on legislative gridlock to take on a much more aggressive policymaking role. And I think we would argue that probably the most powerful policymaking actor today in terms of the ability to shift policy on its own is the Supreme Court. Just in the past few years, the court has transformed the policy landscape on abortion, campaign finance, guns, union rights, voting rights, and environmental regulation. None of these policies could have passed Congress. None of them had a majority support in Congress, but none have been overturned by a gridlock Congress. All, of course, push policy in a conservative direction, right? And more generally, we argue that this current nationalized political system gives important advantages to conservatives. One key reason is rural overrepresentation in the Senate, when combined with the Electoral College, has enabled the GOP to stack the courts with a 6-3 conservative majority, despite losing the popular vote for the presidency in 7 of the past 8 elections. The court then subjects liberal and Democratic executive actions to much stricter scrutiny than Republican actions. Just think about for example, how Biden's student loan forgiveness executive action was largely stymied in the courts. There's also, we argue, an asymmetry between the parties' agendas that makes legislative gridlock and the filibuster in particular especially costly to Democrats. So if you think about Republicans' top legislative priority, it's tax cuts, and congressional budget rules allow those to be passed without needing 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. Beyond tax cuts, if you think about what else do Republicans want to accomplish, a lot of that can be done through executive action. Think about immigration enforcement and potentially Trump's deportation agenda, rolling back environmental regulation enforcement. These can be done by the court, especially by the president, abetted by a conservative court. By contrast, if you think about most of the issues Democrats want to act on, they require legislation, and that legislation needs 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. And think about issues like immigration reform, healthcare coverage expansion, abortion rights, minimum wage hikes, stricter environmental regulation. So the bottom line in terms of policy is that polarization gives us a gridlock Congress, but that has meant power shifted to the president and the courts, and that in turn is biased policy in a conservative direction, often contrary to public opinion. All right. Now, when it comes to the durability of democratic institutions, we really highlight two major concerns that this new configuration raises. The first is an entrenchment of minoritarian rule. And the concern here is that the Supreme Court is not just using its power to push policy in a conservative direction, it's also stacking the political deck in ways that empower certain interests and disempower others in a way that can become self-reinforcing. So this involves making regulation harder. It also involves weakening the power of labor unions, which has long been a kind of counterweight to business power in our democratic system. Undermining campaign finance limits so that the wealthy have more and more influence in politics. Enabling voting laws that are intended to make it harder for racial minorities and democratic constituencies to vote. You can think of this as, in a way, hacking the Constitution, using hardball tactics that are legal, that are allowed, or the court says are allowed, to further tilt the playing field in a kind of conservative direction and potentially entrench their power in a way that is going to be harder and harder for majorities to overcome. Second concern, which Paul alluded to when he talked about Watergate and former President Trump, is the threat of executive domination and abuse of power. Now, as Watergate makes clear, Congress has played a key role in the past in checking presidential abuses. But these checks in the system are undermined by strong party teams operating across institutions. Right? And one way to think about that is to engage in a thought experiment about how Republican office holders would act should there be a second Trump administration. So if a future President Trump were to take actions that abuse his power, which he certainly has indicated he is planning to do, how would Congress respond? Now, the Madisonian system is premised on the idea that members of Congress will care about their power in the system and defend its role against executive encroachment. I think that's just highly unlikely to happen in an effective way under future President Trump. First of all, if he has unified party control, which is a real possibility, I think we can be very confident that Republican leaders will block any serious oversight or pushback efforts from Congress. That's clearly the lesson we learned from the first Trump term. You might think, well, at least if Democrats control one chamber of Congress, maybe that will allow checks and balances to work. And we think that would certainly make a difference in the sense that Democrats would attempt to hold Trump accountable. They would hold a lot of hearings about abuses of power. They demand information. They try to publicize abuses. But I think we can count on a Trump administration basically refusing on a blanket basis to provide any documents requested, to, as he did in the case of impeachment, fight all the subpoenas. And in that scenario, it's very unlikely that the courts, as constituted today, would pressure Trump to provide information. Instead, the immunity decision really clarifies that the court would not check a Republican president who abuses power. And this, in turn, obviously creates really bad incentives when it comes to lawful behavior by a presidential administration more generally. In addition, I think we can assume that Republican members of Congress would stick with Trump when Democrats try to engage in oversight and when he dismisses that oversight as a witch hunt. And that will create a dynamic that is in many ways the opposite of what we saw with Watergate. Because in this case, with Republicans sticking with Trump and his allies in the media sticking with him, essentially the signal sent to the public via that media is going to be one that this is just another partisan fight with Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other, and there aren't constitutional principles at stake. And then with voters inclined to stick with their team, getting these kinds of partisan messages, that will just reinforce Republican politicians' incentive to stick with Trump. So, one way to think about it is that it's essentially inconceivable that Trump would take an action that would lead a substantial number of Republicans to vote to impeach or convict, just an entirely different world from Nixon's, rooted in this very different political configuration. So our one way to think about this is our old constitutional order depended for its durability in part on party politicians only partially acting as members of partisan teams. Where they sat institutionally and where they were from geographically also mattered. In this new constitutional order, that's much less the case, with really worrying implications for the future of American democracy. So just to wrap up, I just want to talk briefly about, well, what can be done about this? And I want to note, this is not a book that says, here's the silver bullet that solves our problems. There just are no simple solutions to the current situation. We do suggest some reforms on the electoral side that we think might help at the margins, especially with respect to trying to empower centrist factions that cross-cut the parties. But given the serious threat posed by entrenchment by a conservative minority, we think one of the main implications of our analysis is that if Democrats at some point in the future were to get a trifecta, in other words, control of Congress as well as the White House, they'll need to make political reform a top priority. They need to use that window of opportunity to push on issues such as voting rights and suppression, gerrymandering, potentially statehood for DC and Puerto Rico, that counter the pro-Republican, pro-rural bias in our institutions. To do any of that, they will need to end the filibuster. None of this would be easy, especially given that there are obviously really important concrete policies that Democrats will have a lot of demands to focus on appropriately. But we think the implications of our argument is that a democracy agenda has to be a priority, because in the long run, otherwise we're going to see this continual tilting of the playing field in a way that risks entrenching minoritarian government. So democracy agenda, in our view, may not be enough, but is an essential step moving forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for that. I think with all of that said, I think we could move into some questions, and I'd like to begin with some thoughts. If you could talk a little bit about the extreme Christian right's influence on the U.S. politics. There appears to be a kind of a mythic cosmology that extreme Christian nationalists have injected into the U.S. body politic. And it's really changed the terrain so much so that it allows people to support Trump, whereas back in the day of Nixon, like you mentioned, people would have lost faith. Do you see a connection?
I think that's certainly an important force on the right in American politics, which a lot of people have written about, and I actually have an earlier book with Jacob Hacker, Let Them Eat Tweets, which talks quite a bit about how, as inequality has grown in the United States, it's made sense for Republicans who don't want to do anything about increased inequality, except maybe intensify it, to shift towards cultural issues as being kind of the anchor for their appeals. And it's a way for them to hold their coalition together, which has brought the Christian right, and into a really prominent position in Republican politics. I think the The other thing I think that is an implication of the book that Eric and I have written for this point is that, Christian nationalists, I don't know what percentage of the electorate you would say that is, but, maybe it's 25% of the electorate, something like that. It's not higher than that, who I think would meet even a pretty expansive definition. And so there's a puzzle about why that in a majoritarian system, right, where you have to get close to 50% in order to win elections, how can that work, right? That a faction that is 20 or 25% of the electorate can play the kind of role that's come to play in our politics. And I think the answer has to be this kind of intense teamsmanship that we're talking about, right? Where once people decide that they're going to ally with one team, they're often willing to cut their own side a lot of slack, right? And tolerate things that they, in some other context, wouldn't favor, right? So that's, I think, one of the really interesting aspects of American politics, and why we argue this in the book, why right-wing nationalism more broadly, or right-wing populism, is such a force in American politics, like even more than it is in a lot of European countries where it's also become more prominent, is because it's possible in the US to take over the conservative political party, right? And once you do that, combined with polarization and combined with the advantage that the conservative party has in our electoral system, they don't have to win 50% of the vote to win, you can end up with really kind of outsized power of these kinds of political forces.
Yeah. Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that, religious conservatives used to be split across the parties, right? There was an evangelical Southern white Protestant faction in the Democratic Party, but then there were also, religious conservatives in the Republican Party in the North. And they both basically, had to contend with and compromise with very different interests. Southern white conservatives were in the same party as Northern liberals, black and white, and that kind of limited their power. What we saw since the 1960s with the realignment on race is the sorting of religious conservatives all into one party, the Republican Party, where they just have a lot more influence, and where kind of each, and as each new issue is after following the racial realignment has gotten onto the agenda, thinking about abortion, issues of sexuality, those have just kind of reinforced those lines, making a kind of sharper cleavage and a kind of stacking of identities, stacking of cleavages between the parties.
Yeah. You both mentioned a bucket list of, if the opportunities arise, what the Democratic Party should probably pay attention to. But on the ground level, for those who are grassroots activists, students, maybe future attorneys, what would your bucket list be for them? What should they be thinking about? What should they be focusing on?
It's a hard question. I guess what I would say is that certainly revitalizing local politics is an important, priority. That is a place where you can make a difference and have some impact. Obviously, localities are very much affected by what happens in Washington, but here, for example, for people in California, there is at least some degree of allowance for some difference in policies, and so trying to make a difference at the local level, I think, can be really important. At the same time, I guess what I would say in terms of national politics and thinking about it, I think it's really important to think strategically and structurally about what's going on. And so instead of attributing some of the things that one finds disappointing, let's say, with contemporary Democrats, to the bad character or lack of commitment of particular Democratic politicians, I think thinking about what the strategic situation they're in, what are the disadvantages that are faced by the party now, and then trying to think creatively about how to adapt to that, right? But to view them as in terms of that kind of very challenging strategic configuration, right? That it's they're competing on a playing field that just is not level right now. Just as an example, to win the Senate, Democrats have to win. It's not enough to win 50% of the votes nationally. They need to win in states like Ohio, Montana, that just lean against the party. That's a structural flaw in our Constitution, but it's also not one we can just wish away. And so we need to think about strategically about how to get the most done within those constraints.
Yeah. Paul, any thoughts?
I think it's a great answer. I mean, we use this metaphor, like, imagine a soccer field that's tilted, right? So that you're kicking uphill all the time. And I do think it's really important for people to recognize that, to understand that, and think about what the consequences of it are. And honestly, I would say I think that it should yield, even for people who are deeply dissatisfied with the political system, maybe a little more sympathy for the challenges that Democrats face in trying to govern in the broad interests of the electorate, or even to win, to be in a position to do that. And I guess just the other thing that I would mention, which again is kind of a point about the structural landscape. Boy, there are a lot of close elections at the national level, like pivotal elections. It's a striking feature of our politics that I think also helps to explain why things have gotten so intense, is that we've been in this kind of 50-50 balance now for, I don't know how long you would say, Eric, but at least 30 years. And we're going into every election, it seems, either side could win. Either side could win the presidency, either side could win control of the House, either side could win control of the Senate. And that makes politics intense, but it also means that that action by ordinary citizens in the electoral domain also matters.
Yeah, I just one other point I'd make is you referenced lawyers and as a potential group, and I do think one area where in the medium term at least Democrats really do need to think hard about action that's very challenging politically is doing something about the Supreme Court. And that's certainly an area where their politicians have been quite timid, in part due to beliefs about how voters will react. And so to the extent that people in the legal profession, as well as activists, can gradually change how the public understands the role of the courts and really see it as a fundamentally political institution that is fundamentally right now endangering core democratic commitments, that's an important message to get out there. I don't think it's something that's in the short term going to yield direct big results, but in the sort of medium term, that's would seem to be a really important part of any kind of progressive political project.
Yeah. I would like to change the focus a little bit now and talk a little bit about your research, because I'm sure there are going to be people watching in the future that are going to wonder how you go about digging in and discovering all that you discover. And as, say students who are curious about your methodology, could you talk a little bit about how you do what you do?
That's a great question. I'll start, and then Eric, maybe hand off to you to talk about the historical part of the book, which is a really fundamental part of what anchors what we're doing. And I'll just so Eric and I have both been at this for quite a long time. We've both written a lot of books, and our offices are right next to each other on the Cal campus. And this is a book that basically grew out of a lot of lunch conversations. We would meet, on a regular basis, just to shoot the breeze sort of about what we were thinking about American politics. And over time, we realized that we were thinking along pretty similar lines about these big structural features of the American political landscape. And so this is a book that does involve some original research, and Eric can talk about pieces of that, but it's actually built on the work of hundreds and hundreds of other scholars. It really reflects, I would say, decades of more focused work on particular topics in American politics, and then our attempt to try to kind of fashion a big picture analysis. And I think very much it grows out of collaboration. I know this is a book that I could not have written by myself. Eric might have been able to write it by himself. I don't know, but I think our areas of knowledge are quite complementary, which allowed us to get together, I think, see things that we probably would not have been able to see on our own. So I'll just say, I think the collaborative part of it, the fact that this is really the outgrowth of decades of thinking and work on American politics is a core part of what we were doing.
I think what I'd add is that, this book is strongly historical. Our approach is historical in two ways. One is kind of the usual way in which one would talk about history is, thinking about history as data, right? So we do deep dives into 3 periods in American politics, drawing on the work of historians and political scientists, as well as targeted data collection that we did to get at particular facets that we thought would illuminate the patterns. And the basic point of that work was to understand how did polarization unfold in prior eras, and to identify what was it that was different in those eras. And we argue that you could see our institutions working in a very different way to allow cross-cutting coalitions, new issues to get on the agenda and disrupt polarization in a way that doesn't happen now. So it's historical in that sense. It's also historical in the sense of trying to treat what's going on today as itself a developmental process that's built up over time. And so to think about the origins of that process, which we date back to the realignment on race in the 1960s, but also this kind of gradual evolution in each of 3, what we call mediating institutions, how state parties have changed, how the media has changed, how interest groups have changed over these past 6 decades. And our argument is that they've each changed in ways that reinforce this nationalized configuration of opposing partisan teams fighting it out, which again, we argue is just incompatible with, or very difficult to square with, this Madisonian system.
Well, we have come to the end of our session. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both for gracing our virtual halls and for all the good work that you do at a time when we find ourselves really on a brink of a precipice. It really helps to better understand how we got here, where we are, and what the road forward holds for us. I'm very grateful to you for being here today. I also want to thank you in the audience for joining us. I want to remind you we have posted links with which you may purchase the books. We will now take a break, and then we'll be back at 2:45 to be joined by Amanda Becker and Erin Geiger Smith. Their session is called Energizing the Electorate, Your Role in Making Change Happen, and What is at Stake.